Okay, while we're waiting for some people to join us, I'm just gonna give a quick introduction. Good evening to everyone, and thank you for being here. My name, if you don't know me, is Shannon Wardlaw. I'm part of this exchange as a DCA for the Pan-African Universities Debating Championship, and I'm also from South Africa. Been debating in the African circuit for a long time, which is an incredibly innovative and competitive circuit filled with change makers. I also recently championed the African Legends Invitational, and I am the current back-to-back champion of Jozi Rumble, which is one of the largest and most prestigious tournaments in Africa. I also coach the Kenya WSDC team, and I'm a development coach for South Africa. This presentation now, today, about institutions and their economics is what my academic background is in. I started out doing a PPE, as is the fate of all serial debaters. And when I moved into organizational institutional studies in my postgraduate degree, I fell in love with this field of study, but something else also happened. Uh, I felt like everything that I'd been learning in debating and coaching to my debate kids suddenly fit together like puzzle pieces. And that was because we were often debating about the role of institutions without ever analyzing them using institutional frameworks. So, what I learned in my own studies greatly impacted my debating speeches. So, whether you're here to hear me speak about my research or learn how I put together my debating speeches, I hope you enjoy the session. Some quick housekeepings. I'm a little bit shaky on the technology side, and I have three tabs open at the same time. So I'm going to ask that you guys just mute and let me yap for about 45 minutes, and then I will open the floor to questions at the end. Also, a reminder that we are recording and posting this on YouTube. That should influence whether or not you want to put your camera on, but also if you drop out for any reason and miss something, you'll get to watch it later. I'm also going to be broadly speaking about certain institutions, particularly governments, state agents, and public good agents like police and healthcare individuals, as well as non-governmental organizations. There are already lots of resources on other institutions, such as central banks, international institutions like the IMF, and cultural institutions and customs. So I encourage you to use this topic to go and revise those other topics later with a new perspective. This is just what I generally did my research in, okay? Now, all of this that we're doing in today's session is to lead up to the question why some countries are able to develop and other countries have not been able to develop to the same degree. All right. So this is a lot. A lot of this comes from Why Nations Fails by Asimoglu and Robinson, which is an examination of the factors that contribute to the success or failure of nations. These Nobel Prize laureates argue that inclusive political and economic institutions are what lead to economic prosperity overall, while extractive institutions lead to poverty and failure. So, that's what we're generally going to be leading up to. But the first question we should probably start with is what are institutions, okay? Institutions are more than just, whoopsie, institutions are more than just organizations. I think when we hear the word institutions, we think about a university, a prison, or a bank. But in economics, the term has a much broader and deeper meaning. Institutions are the visible, invisible rules of our world, and they are humanly devised rules, norms, constraints, and structure our political, economic, and social interactions. So, some examples of this, right? We can have formal institutions, which are obviously established rules, typically written down and enforced by the state, like a constitution, statutory laws, its regulations, legally binding contracts. And the key characterization of these formal institutions is that their enforcement is organized and carried out by the state, usually through state individuals or authority figures. And this includes the police, courts, regulatory bodies that can impose penalties for noncompliance. We can also have economic formal institutions like the central bank, or we can have laws that provide us more economic clarity, like bankruptcy laws, or we can have government corporate codes that are formal rules that dictate how a corporation is administered and controlled. All of these count as formal institutions. Informal institutions are unwritten social rules that are enforced outside of official channels. They happen through social pressure, ostracization, guilt, or the internalization of values, okay? Some examples might be that your state or your people might have a norm of honesty, which is the widespread social expectation that people will tell the truth. It's not enforced by law, but by social disapproval and a loss of reputation. Or the practice of queuing, the unwritten rule that you would wait in a line for your turn, and that effectively helps us to manage shared resources like a checkout counter without the need for a formal law. You can also have more explicit ones like religious and ethnical doctrines, like shared beliefs, like the prohibition against usury or the borrowing of money in certain faiths, or the concept of charitable giving, which is powerfully influenced our economic behavior. And the concept of saving face in many cultures, the formal imperative to avoid public embarrassment shapes our business negotiations and our social interactions. This can also be outside of what we consider to be social spaces, but are still informal institutions because they can be organizational in the way that they present themselves within society. For example, corporate culture. Those are the unwritten way that we do things around here in a company that encourages innovation or stifles it, regardless of the formal rules in the employee handbook, or just generally professional norms. The fact that we all have to wear a suit when we go to professional settings, or strong informal codes amongst doctors to prioritize patient cares, or the norm amongst academics to cite the works of others. The key takeaway here is that we're talking about narratives, we're talking about laws, we're talking about brick and mortar buildings that we can interrogate and protest outside. All of these are present in so many of our debating topics and our institutions that we are talking about, yet we rarely interrogate them as what they are. Both of these formal and informal institutions are powerful, and they constantly interact and influence each other. They are not isolated, they are deeply connected. A strong formal law against a corporation will be ineffective if the informal norm is to accept bribery as the way things are done. Conversely, a strong informal norm of civic duty, for example, can support and strengthen formal democratic institutions. So the success of formal rules often depends on their alignment with underlying informal norms within society, okay? Going a bit further then into what institutions are, this is what I think you guys should be bringing in when you're talking about institutions in your debates. These are your three levels of analysis, or at very least, you're going to try and use one more directly in your debating matter, right? So what are institutions? They are people, information, and policy decisions, not police decisions, policy decisions, whoopsie. All right, so when we talk about institutions as people, when we talk about institution as people, we need to understand that these rules, these norms that are set about by big actors, by our government, by our police systems, etc., they are not set in stone by all external forces, right? They're created, yes, but then what sustains them is people collectively continuing to buy into them and to uphold them. We rat each other out, or we sustain certain laws by telling people, hey, that's against the law, don't do that, okay? So when your debate coach made you do economic analysis, that wasn't just for fun. It was vital to help you understand that institutions do not exist in a vacuum. They are a product of human interaction over time. And people create formal institutions through political processes like legal drafting, collective agreements, and a parliament can vote on a law, but only if society agrees will it continue to be present within that society, okay? So people also sustain informal institutions through their daily actions and choices. Every time we choose to wait in a line or honor a handshake deal, for example, we reinforce this informal rule. People can also change institutions. Social movements, technological innovation, and shifts in our public opinion can render old institutions obsolete and create peer pressure for new ones. Next, institutions are information. What do I mean by that? Okay, what I mean by that is that institutions function as a system for processing and embedding knowledge. They are not just rules, but repositories of collective information about what works and what does not work within a society. And that is encoded in our formal and informal rules. This also reduces the need for everyone to constantly relearn the same lessons by providing a stable set of expectations. Institutions can save us the immense cognitive effort and cost of figuring out every interaction from scratch. In this way, what institutions do uniquely is they create society's collective memory. There's just some things we know to be true, or just some things we know to follow without questioning it. And yes, obviously, everybody here who goes into a debating space takes an extra step in terms of questioning the things around them, but the people who are outside of the debating step do not, circuit do not necessarily always do that, okay? And that preserves and transmits information necessary for the social and economic life across generations and creates a predictable structure for everyday life, okay? However, institutions are also built on their ability to spread and maintain that access to information. One of my important pillars of the research that I did was about studying the NPO uh, circuit in South Africa, right? Non-governmental organizations, non-profit organizations, and why we didn't have as much of a culture of sustaining non-profit organizations as opposed to maybe other developing countries in Southern Africa was the study that I was particularly doing. And what I found was it was directly about systems of information, whether they were able to reach the people or not, okay? There is protection in having a formal system to process your ability to do charitable work through. We don't just want to give money to any random link on the internet because we don't know where that money is coming from. We would like maybe at least a registration code so that we know this is not scammers, this is a formal arrangement. The government, it's keeping an eye on them. We like those kind of systems, right? However, in order to register any kind of charitable work you're doing in Southern Africa under an NPO, right? You would have to be able to fill in forms, particularly in English, particularly discussing things like that you don't necessarily always have the skill set in order to create key initiatives, the ability to create 5-year plans, okay? You'd also need to be able to get in line and transport yourself in order to be able to abide to that process. All of that for people who are from lower class communities who are trying to organize government resources to better sustain their communities don't have access to those formal channels as easily as other people do, which means that the bureaucracy that is associated, the information that's not being passed down to individuals who need access to NPOs the most isn't getting to them. And the people who could best reflect those communities' needs aren't able to process or to be able to abide to those processes. And that means that a large amount of the subsidies and the money that flows through the NPO circuit in South Africa isn't getting to the people who need it the most. And what those people in township communities then express to individuals is that they're tired of people from different non-governmental organizations and NPOs just coming and asking, what do they need? What do they need? What can they do to help? What can they do to help? And it never actually translates into anything for those individuals. So that shows the vitalness of information to be able for people to access formal channels. So institutions are built on that information. Moreover, institutions are built on policy decisions. Policymaking is the primary mechanism for deliberate institutional change, okay? We've already alluded to that formal institutions are often direct products of policy processes. And when it's codified into law or regulation, it does become a formal institution that structures future behavior. So this becomes an important mechanism for deliberate institutional change. However, these decisions are also rarely made in a vacuum. Policy decisions are also shaped by complex policy communities, by politicians, lobby groups, civil servants, interest groups, and experts, all vying to influence whatever our standards, our norms, and our rules are within society. The problem is that policies are incredibly powerful. I would say people and information are also incredibly powerful, but I think it's easy to articulate to a judge that policies are incredibly powerful. Once established, policy-made institutions are incredibly difficult to change. And this is due to what we're going to talk about later, which is path dependence, but also the idea of collective memory. Because if we've been following and abiding to certain policies for years to come, having to change because of critiques to that policy is not going to come easily. People are going to continue to abide to the way that they have been doing things before. And then that means that these institutions have inherently shaped the way people act, the way people engage with one another and created constraints on their efforts. And that harms even access to future policy decisions or our ability to critique them and change them altogether, okay? All state actors are inherently like abiding to policy decisions, okay? Every police officer, every healthcare worker, every bus driver is not making a policy decision is not making decisions as a collective, but they are constrained by the policies and processes which they have to abide to. What does that mean is that our policy decisions are influencing how we see and interact with state actors, but also how our services are supposed to contribute to a functioning society. Moreover, our policies should reflect the wider influence that these institutions have on establishing our norms. So if we see that our policies have the ability to influence the way that we act, then we should also interrogate the way that we act in order to create effective policy norms. For example, public transport. If you have a society that has less access to public transport, it's not the norm. People like primarily use private vehicles or things like Ubers, etc., as opposed to buses, trains, underground subways, things like that. Okay, that establishes two different societies. It is a very powerful and widespread policy that determines how that societal makeup looks like. In a society where it is a common norm in order for people to use public transport, you would have people of all classes being using public transport together. They'd have more interaction with one another at very least. They'd be within each other's eyesight. Whereas in the other society, people of different classes would be quite removed from each other, okay? And that means that people then don't get to interact and see and humanize individuals of different classes and different backgrounds in their daily lives. That society, you could say, leads to more intolerance and exclusion. At very least, like because we're so removed from each other, we create images in our mind of what people from different backgrounds are like and what they act like instead of seeing it for ourselves in person, okay? And the other society, you'd say, might have more of a culture of charity, more of a culture of tolerance, more of a culture of inclusion, or you could make that arguments going forward, right? And I think that that's powerful and important in terms of how policy then shapes our society, because even though that's a decision the governments are making as to where they think most of their money ought to go, it is defining what people's interactions on a daily basis look like. And that also has economic ramifications. I would say also that like every individual is willing to split their food with someone who's hungry in front of them, but if they never see the hungry people, they often then we create concepts of charity that like one society might assume charity is something that only people who are quite rich should be engaging in. And another society might say that anybody is just like engaging in charity as a daily act, regardless of their own economic background. Okay. So, what are all of these things trying to do? We've again talked about like people, information, and policy. The core problem that institutions, when we're building institutions, are trying to solve is uncertainty. We're trying to understand why institutions should exist. We need to first understand the problem that they solve, which is fundamental uncertainty. Yes, life is filled with unpredictability. We cannot know the future actions of others with complete certainty, and that uncertainty, to a large extent, makes cooperation with one another incredibly difficult. It discourages investment and leads to high costs for gathering information and enforcing agreements. So these institutions then emerge to reduce the uncertainty by providing a stable, predictable structure to human interaction. So the solution that they're trying to provide is trust in other individuals, okay? All debaters, when you're talking about principles at some point in your life, you're talking about the social contract. And I think we know what that is, but I very rarely see people use it in debates as much as they should be doing. The idea that when we're born, we sign a contract that says we will abide to the rules of this society, those unspoken rules that are defined by our institutions, okay? So the most simple example of this is that we can't go around harming each other. We aren't allowed to just stab people because we would like to. We know that from a young age, we're told that. So this can be seen as one of our first restrictions of absolute freedom for the greater good. And that means that we can then talk to one another. We can walk past one another without fear of random violence. So we trust each other more within our society because of the establishment of that norm, that social contract, that people are not supposed to just like blanket harm each other, that that's disproved and frowned upon, that that's restricted by our legal system, okay? And thus we can then participate participate in society. If we break these rules, say you did go around randomly stabbing people, I'm sure some of you want to say in the chat that you would love to do that, then you are not allowed to participate in society anymore. We remove you from society through a process like incarceration, which is another institution that's holding up these kind of norms, okay? So we send you to prison, right? And thus, we then don't generally stab one another because ultimately, as much as we complain and divide ourselves and isolate ourselves and doom scroll in our beds, we want to live in a society. We want to live in a society so that we can work together, exchange information, build together things we would never be able to accomplish on a desert island all alone, and also so that we can reap the benefits of social interactions, have social interactions, be able to date, have friendships, be able to engage with one another on social media in the comment sections, okay? But if you were to ask a small child why they can't go around stabbing people, they would not tell you about protection of the body being the expansion of personal autonomy, being the vessel that we have our personal autonomy embedded in, and that the consequential and categorical value of these actions will undermine the very fabric of our democratic society. No, that small child will simply say, because it's against the law, thus showing how institutions translate complex discussions into decisive rules and therefore create trust for us to engage in. Okay. A note on the descriptive analysis, right? I think a lot of people like to say that I do a little bit of descriptive analysis well in debating. And so people are always asking me how to do that. And I had to really think about that for a little bit, right? But it's all about just like, sometimes it's just about having a little bit of a guideline. I really enjoyed Hadar Goldberg's Burdens of Proof lecture on YouTube because she has like small simplistic formulas to certain debates. I also try and do that. And so when I'm looking at institutional change and trying to create institutional change, I go back to this formula of, are we discussing people? Are we discussing changing information? Are we discussing changing policy? Okay. Because it is important to discuss in your debates, what does institutional change look like in this debate, right? Especially when you're talking about any of these broad things we've already brought up, okay? It is important to note, though, but because of that embedment of collective memory through information passing down, through policy structures, right? Through the fact that people are inherently part of institutions, change is typically slow. It's incremental in its process, and that's largely due to that collective memory, to that path dependence. And that can be driven, it can be driven completely to a different degree by external shocks like war or financial crisis, which can disrupt the existing order of things. But I don't think anybody wants to argue that we should start a war or a financial crisis in order to inherently change our institutions. So we're looking at probably smaller incremental institutions. What I would like describe it as is that the changes you are making are pivotal to the long-term changes of these institutions or embedding the norms that you want to look at. Because even if it is slow change, it can be important, pivotal change that isn't going to be easily reversed, okay? So that can be driven by evolving informal norms, which eventually will pressure the formal norms also to adapt, okay? But the important question there is, what exactly are you changing? All right. Are you changing the people? Are you changing the information? Are you changing the policy decisions? Again, not police decisions. All right. Don't forget to mute when you come in. Okay. This challenge of this reform is a little bit more intense, right? I think we also need to acknowledge that simply copying the formal laws or the institutional practices of a successful country and applying it to our country in order to create some kind of better results doesn't work because the contexts are different. The people, the information, the cultural structures, the way we interact with one another are different. So you can't just apply how one institution looks somewhere to the way it should work in a different context, okay? And that is an interrogation of also the informal institutions, right? The norms, the culture, the trust, which are not also copied over. Successful reform requires a deep understanding of the local context and the existing institutional matrix, okay? So that's already our first bit of what do institutions look like. Now let's try and define what is our ideal institution? What does like the top institution we're trying to create, regardless of the context that it's trying to deal with, what is it trying to generally do and create as a benefit in our society? Couple of things. All right. Firstly, reducing transaction costs. Secondly, defining and protecting property rights. Thirdly, enforcing contracts. And fourthly, defining our behavior. Right. In terms of reducing transaction costs, the most important economic function of institutions is to reduce what economists call transaction costs, which are the costs associated with making economic exchange. If it's easier for us to process value and create liquidity within society so that we can extract value from our resources quickly, so that we can define our economic processes more smoothly, so that we're not constrained by those barriers, but that doesn't necessarily mean a free market. We're going to talk about that more. Then an institution is doing a good job in terms of creating economic prosperity, right? This includes like the cost of searching for information, bargaining and negotiating, and it also links to enforcing contracts, okay? So providing a legal system, a standard, and social trust, institutions can make exchanges smoother, faster, cheaper, right? For example, if we had there is the flaw of markets where it is like perfect information is a flaw of free markets because we don't have access to perfect information. Example of that would be when you're buying something processed from the grocery store, none of us are food scientists. We don't have the ability to read every ingredient and decide if that is something that we're willing to put in our body. We don't have the time to do that. We don't have the time to learn about every ingredient and every product and everything that we're going to be purchasing throughout our lives. And that lowers our purchasing power if we're forced to engage in those transaction costs because that is a trade-off of our time. Okay, so what do? You simply trust that the government has set up a food quality and safety institution that is only allowing top quality things that are not going to harm you if ingested onto store shelves, so that when you buy them you know you're always making a safe purchase. Okay, that is you trusting an institution that is reducing transaction costs within our economy. All right, secondly, we could talk about institutions defining and protecting property rights, okay? This is another crucial function, is the definition and protection of property rights. So obviously, property rights define who owns what they can do with their property, and how they can transfer it. And secure property rights can be the bedrock of investment and innovation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to expand private property for the elite or the rich in our society as much as possible, but simply to understand that, like, when we talk about that land has political power or that there's some kind of importance behind people having security in ownership, that those are vehicles that we can expand through how our institutions process and define property rights within our society. Okay, so it creates confidence, it creates trust in our government if we have some sense of ownership in our labor, in our processes. Even just the idea of having a democratic voice within our elections and our processes is ownership within our democratic process. Like yeah, processes. Okay, if you are not confident that you can reap the benefits of your work, of your investments, of your time and effort from engaging with your government, you are far less likely to invest in building parts of your society, in starting a business, in investing in new technology. So defining and protecting those property rights and how you look at them is important. Another lecture you guys can go and watch after this that I always highly recommend is Ashish Kumar's Super Shiny Principles, one of the best debaters in the world, retired very early. There's articles written about it. Anyways, but in his lecture on Super Shiny Principles, he talks about a debate where the discussion was about like if people who are experiencing incredibly bad service delivery, I can't remember what it was, or poverty, can use violence against the state. And he said that like in his speech, he made an example of if he went up to the opposition and simply took their phone, that everybody would feel as though like that was wrong, and there would be a process to restore that phone to its rightful owner. People would be allowed to pull it out of Ashish's hands. People would be allowed to tackle him in order to get the phone. So we consistently exacerbate to the point of violence in order to protect our property rights, which shows just how important a sense of ownership, a sense of ideal in our society is to individuals, right? And therefore, the link he simply had to make, besides the second argument about that be about going against poverty is a form of self-defense, but just that simply that people have ownership in their democratic states and in their nation would thus mean that they are right to take on a form of violence in order to uphold against their governments. They would be justified in doing it. Okay. So go and watch him talk about it. I'm sure he delivered it a lot better than I just did. Okay. So this is important, right? Because in many countries, poor individuals live on land and operate businesses without formal legal titles, which means that because they lack this formal property right, or they're renting, or they're like occupying, whatever the instance is, they cannot then use that asset that they have to engage with as collateral for a loan to expand their businesses. And that means that it forms part of dead capital, which is a massive drag on economic development, all stemming from a weak formal institution that doesn't protect property rights under the assumption of who's using and engaging on that property. Okay. All right. More than on this, enforcing contracts and building trust. All of these are premised on building trust, but enforcing contracts, I think it's easy to pinpoint where trust comes into that. Instead, institutions are also essential for enforcing agreements and building trust beyond our immediate circle. A contract is simply a promise about future actions unless there is a system to enforce it. And then it's just a piece of paper. If we go back to the example I was talking about earlier about this, does your society have a culture of charity? And you would need a formal way to process and register charities in order for you to create trust in that culture of charity. It's the same idea of enforcing a contract, that I believe that if I give you money, that it's going to go to the people who need it the most, okay? So we have things like the legal system that provides a third-party enforcement mechanism that allows strangers to engage in complex long-term exchanges. And this enforcement capability is what allows modern, large-scale economies to function. So often we talk about courts only as mechanisms of justice. We should also talk about courts as institutions that create the basis of whether people are willing to work together and how we establish our labor laws as well, okay? And then lastly, defining our behavior. Institutions can create a system of incentives and punishments that guide our actions. They can make certain behaviors more beneficial, others more costly, and they can steer us towards socially acceptable and cooperative outcomes, okay? This system operates in the background, often so seamlessly. Guys, please don't draw on my things. Can you erase that, please? Okay. This system can operate so seamlessly that we often internalize these rules without conscious thought. For example, we've already talked about how our formal institutions define behavior through explicit legal and economic consequences, like traffic laws, like property rights. We've already spoken about, okay? And we've talked about how informal institutions can shape behavior through social pressure and internalized norms. So ultimately, those institutions are building predictable environments that condition our choices, and thus we behave differently in a library than we do in a sports stadium, because the context is very clear and we understand what our behavior is in both of those instances, okay? And this predictability enforced by both formal and informal means is what allows us for trust and cooperation between each others, okay? But that's easy because that is very obviously premised on us directly being told to do or not do something, okay? However, our institutions could also shape our lives in less explicit ways. For example, institutions can create perverse incentives that lead to unexpected and counterproductive outcomes. We've all heard of like the Cobra effect. It's a very common debating story, again, that we never link back to institutionals, which is the historical anecdotes about that, people would say, we'd give you a bounty, we'd give you some money for every dead cobra that you bring because there's an infestation of cobras in our city. And instead, people would start breeding their own cobras just to kill them and collect the money instead of actually dealing with the infestation within the city. And so the government scrapped that program. The breeders then released the snakes and ultimately increasing the cobra population and the problem that it was trying to solve. So you can see there that an institution didn't really consider its economic incentives, how people behave, the norms within its society. It just thought incentive equals you do this. And it becomes more complex when we consider and discuss the role of people in our institutions, in our policy framework, okay? Thirdly, they can shape our cognitive frameworks, influencing what we see as possible or
Yes,
even thinkable. Guys, please don't
yes.
forget to mute
This is
and
30 minutes ago.
questions at the end only. Someone is
That
unmuted.
is 30
All right.
minutes ago.
So, for example, we have already the norm of standardized career paths within our societies. We're told from a young age to at least go to university, at most to pursue stable careers over careers in the arts and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. This institutional framework of formal education and cooperative and corporate ladders can make unconventional career paths seem risky or not something that individual can pursue, and that unconsciously steers generations towards a narrow set of acceptable professions that we've defined as acceptable or needed within our society. And that can possibly limit certain markets, or it can just overall limit innovation and personal fulfillment in unintended ways. Okay. And also, fourthly, in extension to that, right, that also means that we can redirect in a perverse way our energy towards gaming the system rather than being productive in the system. So, for example, standardized tests, we just set a motion about standardizing testing for kids to talk about, and I got to talk about this example. We have standardized tests to determine who it has higher grades than the other, as who is smarter than the other. We use this for our university applications, okay? So we've created an institution, a testing institution that's meant to ensure education quality and ensure, meritocracy when we channel people into more formal tertiary education pursuits, okay? But that can unintentionally shape classroom behavior. Teachers now don't then teach to make critical thinkers, to make widespread thinkers, but they focus narrowly on the testable material and being able to provide the testable material and be able to parrot learn the testable material. And that sacrifices deeper learning and creativity, thus making people less prepared for real life, less prepared for tertiary education. And they do that just so that they can have the positive results that is set up by the norms of the institution. So it redefines success then, because we still assume that we want you to be successful. Everybody here can be critical of our education systems, but if your kids come home with a bunch of D's or 50%, you're still going to be upset, right? So it still defines what is success, and not as a holistic education system, but simply just as maximizing a test score. Okay, so ultimately, what I've shown you through these examples is that institutions define our behavior by defining what's normal, what's rational, and that constrains our choices because we don't want to make non-normal and unrational choices, right? And so our imagination is also then constrained in the way that we present ourselves and engage in the world around us, okay? So this all shows how institutions can shape our lives in less explicit ways by influencing our perception of reality. Another example I want to present here is look at these two pictures, okay? What distinguishes these two pictures of policemen is, do you see why I kept saying police instead of policy? I was thinking about these two pictures the whole time, okay? What distinguishes these two pictures from one another is a very explicit policy decision made by governments, okay? It's a decision about how we enforce our laws. As you can see, one of them is carrying a batoon. That is clearly the common thing that police force would then be carrying. Another one seems to be carrying what we can explain as to be a high-tech gun. What I like about this photo is that the photographer was obviously very clever to picture them next to a military personnel, and you can see that they're carrying carrying the exact same weaponry. So you can see that they are basically exactly the same as the military personnel, even though they are in a police uniform. Great media literacy skills being shown right there, okay? So what this shows is a contrast between two societies, one where the police is more militarized than the other one being less militarized than the other, okay? All right. So we know that institutions like the police are pillars of our social contract, our unspoken agreement, okay? And we preach logic behind escalating steps to escalating crime statistics. However, when police officers begin to operate in ways that feel oppressive or illegitimate, like you can think of an example of a police officer being corrupt or involved in crime or violence themselves, then it can undermine the public's willingness to adhere to the police, right? Similarly, adopting a warrior cop mentality from the militarization of police officers because they've been given the tools of militarization through government policy also undermines the public's willingness to adhere to these social contract norms themselves, and potentially making society less cooperative with the people who are supposed to make them safe and more distrustful in one another, distrustful in our state agents, distrustful in our state as a whole, which makes actually the police less effective rather than more effective by being further militarized, okay? So when police resemble an occupying army, it can shatter the community's trust necessary for a cooperative society. And this has been shown in research, like in the United States, 1033 program, which has been talked a lot about on social media lately because of the ICE raids that are happening. Okay, this was the program that specifically transferred military equipment to local police, and it was found to have a socially a fragmenting effect. Okay, so then what happens is we start to view the state as an oppressor, as someone who
What?
is, directly like threatening us, and we start to assume our neighbors are criminals because we're not the criminal. Obviously, we're not thinking about that, right? So we think that the presence of serious guns means that there is the presence of
How
serious criminals. So we start to
you?
treat guys. Can we please mute? Who is unmuted? This is actually
Huh?
very disrespectful. Rahim, Caitlin, Phil, Phila, can you guys please mute? People are still unmuted. Phil, Phila, can you please mute? Rahim, you have two devices. Okay, cool. Thank you. I love and appreciate you all. All right. So what we're talking about, yes. So you start to assume that there are extreme criminals within your community, okay? And you're like, oh yes, I did hear something on the news about climbing crime statistics. Now that's at the front of your mind, okay? So we start to treat each other as if there are immoral actors sitting next to us on the bus, or who are going to school with us, who are residing near one another, threatening one another, regardless of whether they actually are or not, because we don't know that. We don't know individuals' actual criminal records, okay? And this is specifically means that we then become less cooperative in ways that you probably couldn't even track, right? That what this the study of the US 1033 program found that like overall charitable donations declined in society, and they found that there were links to, how the police were acting within society. All right, especially from marginalized communities, had huge decreases in their overall charitable givings, and that suggests that militarization increases social distance, like not social distance as in stay 5 feet away from each other during COVID, but generally that we less want to interact with people within our community. And that means that we feel less connected and we feel less obligated to support one another. So that's a small but coercive change in our daily life, okay? This is important because what this shows is that institutions affect everyone. We often argue for more military presence to scare the real criminals into behaving, but the reality is everyone gets scared and everyone acts like they're scared. What's worse is that the increasing trend of militarization of the police force is not because of increasing crime statistics, they're stable, but rather because of expanding free market access to top grade weapons. And opportunists are thus pitching to governments rhetoric about increasing crime with the sole intention to sell these weapons, and not because of a real interrogation of their societal norms and what could be effective policies, okay? Which then perfectly leads into our next section, which is then adding into the economic lens, into this institutional lens we've now broadly talked about, okay? So the economic lens here in institutional economics is the foundation of the school of thought known as institutional economics. I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about this before. And this is the field that argues that you cannot understand an economy by looking only at its market and prices, but instead you must understand the institutional framework within which those markets operate. So this challenges the simplified view of economics and brings in history, politics, and sociology into a richer analysis, okay? One of the key points I'm going to be bringing up here comes from Douglas North, okay? So his argument actually mirrors what we were talking about from Acemoglu and Robinson earlier about how our institutions affect our economics and our economies, okay? So Douglas North was an American economic historian who won also the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, but in 1993, not as recently. And he was a leading figure in new institutional economic school of thoughts. And basically, the central argument he's putting forward is that with institutions, that he also defines the way I've defined in this lecture, humanly devised constraints that structure our political, economic, and social interaction. They are the determinants of our society's economic performance. You would think it's not, but it is, right? So he argued that while technology and education are important, it's actually the institutional structures that shape the incentives to develop our technological markets and our education markets, okay? And so what the central concept that he proposes that helps us to understand this is path dependence. I've already brought it up twice in the lecture, but focus with me here, okay? So basically, think of this as like a tree with many branches. Once you start to cut down one of the branches, it becomes difficult to switch to another. This means that past choices of historical events of a society heavily constrain its present and future choices. That's the exact like analogy he uses within his work, okay? So this explains why ineffective institutions can persist for a long time, trapping nations in poverty. And this also links to other things I've already brought up, right? So you can understand path dependence as collective memory, creating institutional norms. You can think about it as embedding policy that become more and more difficult for then you to remove out of society, all right? And then the second thing that he brings up, and actually Asamoglu and Robinson also talk about this, is a distinction between inclusive and extractive institutions, okay? He was building on Asimoglu and Robinson's work on this, okay? So very basically, inclusive institutions secure property rights, uphold the law, and create a level playing field for all. They're ideal what institutions should look like, okay? This can still be built through central planning and welfare provision, but the idea is that at very least we have secure property rights, upholding the law, and creating a level playing field for all. All right. In contrast, extractive economic institutions are designed to extract wealth and resources from the many to benefit a few. So when I talk about this, I think generally we first get the question of like, well, isn't that just corruption? And isn't that just an ineffective institution rather than an extractive institution? Like, what's the point of bringing that up? All right. And so here's maybe where we're having a little bit of difficulty and a deadlock in our debating in terms of how we are discussing corruption and the solutions towards corrupt societies, okay? Because corruption is often associated with a functioning institution that is built on being inclusive, like our ideal institution should be, but is being actively undermined or disregarded by the greed of certain actors. That is something that is very easy to identify within society, and the role of society then is to be punitive towards that, to say, don't do that so that we can continue to benefit from an inclusive and established institution. But what happens if the institution wasn't inclusive to begin with and wasn't very well established and effective to begin with? For example, many post-colonial states have local governments that mismanage funds and policies because their systems were built on English or French speakers and processes that still abide to those languages that they don't speak, and or at least to the same degree of jargon. Think about the expansive political and economic jargon you guys are learning in university, and think about that having to go down to communities who are never having access to those learning channels. Okay, is that actively corruption? It's mismanagement, but is it bureaucratic failure instead? Equally, a state can increase taxes to subsidize business proposals that have high conditions, such as tertiary education, expertise, and experience. And you might find that to be a good economic policy, but that is indicative of an extractive institution. Okay. So you can see here how that's different to active corruption. Extractive institutions, whether they are unfairly centralized wealth or not, are working exactly the way they are built to. Now, this can help us to have a bit more of a thorough idea of how we're dealing with like different states. Okay, I'm going to make an example of North Korea and South Korea. It's a very common example in this field of study about extractive and inclusive institutions. Okay, so after the Second World War, these two states, although very similar in cultural ideals before that, took on completely different institutional paths. One was defined by communism, the other one was defined by free market economies. Okay, with North Korea being defined by central planning and South Korea defined by free market economies. Okay, what happened was then defined by the economic incentives that are created by those different institutions. So in South Korea, capital was obviously then pursued based on an individual's ability to benefit and profit from it. If there was no benefit and profit from it, then your company would go bankrupt, people wouldn't demand it, and thus capital would thus be reallocated to more valuable uses that was based on individuals' demands, which is not always most valuable, but it's at least based on individuals' demands, right? So society was built on collaboration and trust, and that's why we get things like Hyundai, K-pop, Korean skincare. It's a pretty well-functioning market economy responding to consumer demands. North Korea is an economy that is centrally planned and directed, and people didn't have the freedom to start businesses, just looking at like what is necessary within society. But moreover, what distinguishes North Korea from just like any kind of centrally planned economy was that it was also authoritarian in nature, which meant that human energy was going into political campaigns to shut down any opposition and to maintain control of the people who have control. What has that led to economically is then people don't see any benefit from their production and labor. They don't see any any kind of incentive to add on to the state. They don't see any trust in the state that they're that it's even going to lead to anything beneficial without huge punitive measures. And what that has meant is that then there's also been large periods of starvation for lower class individuals because yes, farmers are incentivized to produce enough food for the elites who are then going to punish them if they don't produce enough food, but not necessarily for the wider market because it doesn't benefit them solely. It doesn't benefit them or incentivizes them. Okay. Now, notes on this, right, is that like communism or central planning doesn't need to be linked to authoritarianism and cults of personality in order for it to operate in any kind of capacity. So obviously then what distinguishes North and South Korea's institutions isn't their political ideology, but whether their institutions, A, were extractive or inclusive, and B, whether they had the ability to establish trust between themselves and their people. Thirdly, also, I think brings in Karl Marx's theory about people need to feel tied and feel connected to their labor, which you should know is actually a critique of capitalism in favor of communism. So what this overall provides then is a much wider, greater critique that isn't so politically charged or made into consistent memes on social media, okay? That's what that case study does. So what does this go back to when we bring up the question, so why are some nations rich and others poor? All right. The answer is then not geography or culture, at least not primarily. The fundamental cause is man-made political and economic institutions that are embedded into our society, create collective memories and path dependence that distinguish us from other nations broader than just the critique within an academic paper. And this brings up the point that we made earlier again, is that you cannot then copy over one institution and apply it to a new context. When you're building models and debates, I think a very common mistake that people make is they say, well, if this works in Europe, it has to work in Africa. And that's again just rhetoric, just saying that's just how it is, instead of using what I just taught you to define and articulate the institutional uh, components of why this would work and wouldn't work. Okay. Also, then this highlights what Simonglu and Robinson's argument was from the beginning, that nations fail today because of their extractive institutions, for example, how they function regardless of their ideology, that can create incentives for corruption or just stagnation while failing to protect the rights and innovations of their citizens. Okay. Moreover, how does this link then back to what you'd probably be arguing and debating? Okay. I think that this also breaks a deadlock that we often have about how much regulation should we have in society versus how much freedom should we have in society, and how that goes back to our ability to create economic prosperity. This is actually evident in a lot of motions that you're already getting. Maybe you don't even realize it. Two examples would be, should we have patents for healthcare provisions in Africa? Or secondly, should we restrict the expansion of artificial intelligence? This is where you would probably have one team arguing that regulation is inherently a barrier, creating red tape, slowing down processes and stifling entrepreneurial freedom. I would argue that, depending on the side of the motion, okay? They will use examples of bureaucratic delays and argue for minimal state intervention. Another team might argue that, well, regulations can launch institutional counterattacks, or just regulations are necessary to get rid of major evils. Okay, so how do we resolve this? Okay, the way we would resolve this is by saying that the state's role is not to get out of the way and thus remove all regulations and allow the free market to prevail in every single market, but rather to enable that market to be its best self by building the road that these innovators drive on. Okay, so do we do that? We reduce through our regulation uncertainty and transaction costs, okay, that require massive investments in research and development, by giving clear, stable regulations on things like intellectual property and contract enforcements that can create a predictable environment where firms or opportunist capitalist individuals feel more secure to invest in the long term. Okay, or we can also argue that like regulations create and thus define new markets as opposed to the markets that are already existing. So then that changes the wording of the debate slightly, is that whether we're stifling or removing this market. No, we're just redefining it as a different market, one that is regulated and that abides to that regulation. Okay, so we're not just restricted to the rules of that market. For example, this would be like with data privacy laws that created the entire field of tech privacy innovation, and environmental standards then spurred the clear energy sector. Those are new markets that came up, and the question was, were they going to be defined by their institutions and their links to them or not? All right. And then also you can say, thirdly, that regulation builds trust necessary for collaboration, that strong regulations ensure product safety, consumer protection, and financial stability. And this builds public trust in new products and services, which is essential for their adoption, or else they're not necessarily going to be widely adopted. Or if they are, they're going to be, underpinned by small instances of scams or small instances of not being able to deliver what they were asking to deliver. Okay, so what then is the real barrier is not regulation, but bad institutions or bad policies, bad regulations. And thus the issue is not the existence of regulation, but its quality. Extractive, corrupt, or arbitrary regulations are ones that are created by bad institutions, and those do stifle growth. But regulation can actually be something that creates more growth if the policy is directed in a way that works with the people, the information, and creates inclusive policies for people to work within. So therefore, the conclusion is that it's not about whether we should have more or less regulation, but about building the right institutional framework to guide innovation and production in a trustworthy direction. And that creates an easy path to victory for you guys then in that debate, which is just to describe why your side uniquely creates that right institutional framework that is necessary for our economic prosperity. So, so easy. I've got a little bit more to get through, so I think I'm just going to go 10 minutes over time. Sorry, guys. Love you all to bits and pieces, okay? All right. Because we generally now have exhausted the chat about that, our economies, our institutions affect our economies. But also, what I generally want to talk about is how our economies also affect our institutions. Okay. Now, when we have, people creating policies on the basis of how profitable they'll be for actors who are trying to profit off of those policy decisions, then the economic incentives are actually what drives the quality of the policy and the quality of the institution. For example, an easy example of this is private prison systems. Private prisons are when someone who has a lot of money is setting up a prison to fulfill the ability that the government is not doing to create that kind of judicial punitive incarceration system. Okay. But they're not done doing that because they just love the government official and want to do it out of the kindness of their heart. They need to profit off of it somehow. So we established tenders. Those tenders mean that you get some kind of cuts as long as you continue to uphold this incarceration system, manage it, you get some kind of profit, some kind of benefit from that. Okay. Then what happens then is that if your system is incredibly good at stopping reoffenders, and in an extreme example, in 10 years from now, there's no more crime, you don't get that economic benefit of being able to run the incarceration system anymore. And so what happens is that private prisons often have, and this is true, legal quotas to be met for how many people ought to be incarcerated over a span of like 5 years or something like that, targeted goals in order for them to reach, in order to show that not only is their incarceration system necessary, but effective at locking people up. And that creates additional pressure on policing and police systems to get people into the incarceration system. This objectively leads to what we consider to be racial profiling today, because then individuals who are part of the police force need what they consider to be easy targets to get through to the incarceration system, and so they overly target people that they believe judges will easily put behind bars so that they can adjust to and meet those quotas. They keep their jobs, individuals continue to profit. And so the economic incentives there created a bad institution, or an institution that wasn't actually meeting the goals of why it existed within society, which was actually to try and create a society where we didn't have to worry about criminals on the street, but rather now there's intense overcarceration and intense racial profiling as to what we see as criminals on the street. Okay. This then links into other things, right? The economics of institutions is incredibly relevant also to our modern digital age, because the internet has created new spaces that require new institutions. And we see this in formal norms on online communities and informal rules of digital copyright laws. So the entire field of cryptocurrency, for example, is an attempt to create new decentralized institutions. And the reason they want to be decentralized is because that's what competitively stands to keep them apart from like centralized banking systems or formal banking systems. They're trying to meet a demand for changes within the way that we create our financial transactions. And therefore, the economic incentive is what is employing that institutional change or that movement away from that, as opposed to working with those institutions or trying to abide to those institutions. Those are two examples to show you then that it goes the other way around, that our economics can also affect the quality of our institutions. Okay, some quick critiques of this and limitations of what I've talked about today, because no kind of framework that you're ever going to discover is absolutely perfect. I'm just the only one honest enough to tell you about it, okay? So some people can argue that in like looking at institutions as a whole can be too deterministic, suggesting that, countries' fates might be sealed by their historic institutions and difficult to change, might seem like there's no hope. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I hope I've displayed that to you. Also, that measuring the quality of institutions, especially informal ones, is notoriously difficult. I 100% agree with that one. I would argue that in debates. And then lastly, while institutions are critical, they are not the only factor that you know, affects countries or even just one individual market's success. There's ideas, leadership, and also just sheer luck that play a role in those economic outcomes. Okay, so some key takeaways about what I've talked to you guys today. Just to summarize, then broadly what we've talked about. Firstly, economic activity shapes institutional development more than institutional development shapes economies. Secondly, we can take anything that is a normative motion in debating, and instead of heavily relying on rhetoric, we can shift to descriptive analysis based on this institutional framework. We can describe the people, the policies, and the information. Worst, you will not have any particular impacts, but you'll seem like you really understand the debate better than the speaker who is just shouting, "That's just how it is." But at best, what institutional knowledge has uniquely stopped me from doing in debates is moaning about and shouting about the presence of bad actors and immoral and evil agents, and has rather asked me to interrogate where their incentives come from and where their collective memory comes from. And that means that you can actually analyze more specific problems than that you then simply just need to show that your side of the debate uniquely addresses it. Instant 85s all round, something for you guys to be able to get, okay? A couple of other things, right? We talked about institutional quality is the fundamental cause of the differences between how we're able to access wealth within our nations. Inclusive institutions foster growth and extractive institutions hinder it. Institutional change is path dependent. It creates collective memory, and that's why reform is incredibly difficult. So if you're especially arguing in your social justice or you're accessing social change motions, this is something for you to consider. It's a new way of looking at it. And lastly, understanding institutions is essential for analyzing everything from corporate governance to the regulation of the digital economy. In conclusion, I think that what I've shown is that institutions are invisible architecture of our economic lives. They are the reason we can trust a stranger to deliver a product, why we invest in our future, and why complex societies can even function to begin with. And so, by studying their economics, we gain a powerful lens for understanding the wealth and poverty of our nations, the success of our businesses, the failure of other businesses, and the challenges in our ever evolving world. So, thank you guys for your attention. I'm now going to close the slides. We'll share them to relevant groups if necessary, but you'll also be able to see this all on YouTube. At this point, I'd just like to ask if anybody has any questions you'd like to bring up before we close the session. If not, you're welcome to leave, and I'll see you guys in the YouTube comment section and at our next tournaments. Thanks, everyone. Oh, yes, the sessions are definitely recorded, and I will happily send the slides to anybody who wants to know. Any questions? Or if not, you can just tell me something that really stood out to you. You can do it in the chat, or you can raise your hand and tell me something that you're taking away from the session. I'd also love to hear any feedback. Yeah, Toby, you can unmute if you want.
Sorry, I hope I'm audible.
You're audible.
Cool. So I did want to just confirm. I wanted to ask if, um, basically, does it mean that at the end of the day, even if we do try to like better society, we may still sort of depend on like the institutions that are currently leading to some negative effects to be able to like make that change?
I think it's a great question. So I think of institutions as vessels right now, and their current operations are what we can generally change. All right. So I want to say that we should always have some kind of presence of a legal system. We should have some form of governance, or else we're just having absolute anarchy. And you guys can also argue for that. That's just not where my research is necessarily from. But the way that our economies are structured right now, the way that our judicial systems are structured right now, and the way that our governance systems are structured right now are things that need to change and absolutely can change. Even if that change is incremental and small, absolutely it's something that we can establish within society to rather make our institutions work for us rather than having us work for our institutions. Does that answer your question, Toby?
Yeah, yes, it does. Thank you, Shannon.
Cool, awesome. Another question here, is it possible to have contradicting institutional laws and how does this affect governments? Absolutely, absolutely. Not just laws. You can just have contradictory institutional frameworks, right? So, like, what is in the law and what is customary, not just in like cultures, but just in general societal behavior, can be contradictory to one another. And then sometimes the law is just like not useful or it's self-defeating in that regard. But also, like, our legal system can literally create two different laws that contradict one another. Usually, I will say, like, when that happens, it happens because someone is profiting from one of the interpretations of the law only being able to apply to them and not to somebody else. I think an example of this is, with 15% carbon tax in my country, in South Africa, right? This is something that exists in legal practice but isn't really upheld. And so the workaround there is how there's a distinction about like how much carbon you should actually be emitting in order to qualify for that tax or something like that. And so what that means is then people who are part of the movements who are lobbying for less carbon emission feel like they have some kind of win and some kind of engagement from their governments through a mechanism like carbon tax, but it doesn't actually result in anything that's actually helpful for individuals. So the differences there can be contradictory. Another contradiction that isn't necessarily a bad thing in society is that we establish laws against animal cruelty, but we allow certain levels of cruelty in systems that create processes for us to, have meat on the table. So when we milk cows, it's really cruel, it's harmful for them, but we use that process to try and get as much milk out as possible so that we can distribute that product to the people. People like to drink milk and eat meat, so we're okay with that. We both of those laws exist at the same time. They can be contradictory, but it establishes something we find good within society rather than something we find bad. Any other questions? I'm also just going to read some of the comments out because I don't know if this is going to show up on the YouTube video, but taking back home how to nuance on institutions and how they function, then make wild guesses that institutions affect our economics and vice versa. I heard that right. If I heard that right, absolutely you did. And then also what happens when international institutions are now restricted from enforcing international laws like the US mining underwater minerals, as opposed to international maritime laws that every other nation is signatory to. I think that's also a great example. I'm not sure where specifically you were bringing that up for, because I don't know what time this was presented, but yes, key takeaways and main points, institutions and their economics work hand in hand. And another question, oh, you guys are great. I love this. When supposedly good institutions start to fail or become problematic, for example, the US judiciary and its interaction with the executive branch, can you draw direct correlations of that failure to more radicalization politically and less trust in the state? Absolutely, you absolutely can, because it can work hand in hand, right? Also, when institutions don't necessarily work in favor of individuals who have a lot of influence or power or money within society, they might put in a lot of money into lobbying or creating some kind of political narratives that push against these institutions and thus lead to their failure. So you can definitely make that observation where you see necessary. Sometimes it's not always necessary. In states that are especially like still trying to establish their nation building and rebuild their institutions, they have other reasons for their failure of their institutions. Either they are not completely being aware of how their institutions should function within their societies. Maybe they're just trying to copy what looks right in another nation. They might have just like not necessarily radicalization, but there's just a lack of investment or interaction with the people on the ground who are being affected by these institutions. Sometimes in a lot of countries, there are a lot of laws that people have to abide to that they aren't even actually aware about because institutional knowledge is failing to be spread. It might be also just like a lack of strengthening of one institution harms the presence of another institution. Like, for example, it's difficult to hold a government accountable and create channels for us to engage with our government if journalism as an institution isn't well funded and isn't well established within our nation. So, absolutely, that can be a critique, but there are other ways you can also critique. So, always just think through everything as much as you can. It seems like such basic debating advice, but you'd be surprised what my kids get up to. Some of my Kenya kids are here and they get up to nonsense. All right, guys, any other questions, comments? Yeah, Isaac.
Hello, am I audible?
Hi.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much for such a comprehensive session. I enjoyed it. My name is Isaac. I recently read a book on why nations fail, and in that book, it argued that nations prosper or collapse largely because of their institutions rather than geography or resources. So, building on that, I would like to ask, because from your session, I learned very much that institutions themselves can be constraining or self preserving in that regard. In a debate, you want to analyze how societies can drive an institutional revolution or a reform. How can you do it, especially if those same institutional structures resist change from within?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you missed the beginning of the session, but we talked about that exact book because it is the basis of a lot of what I'm talking about here. It's something I had to study, you know. And so the argument that uh, Asimoglu and Robinson are making in that book, and that's what we established, we talked through in the second half of the session, is that, because our economic and political institutions are so inherently tied to one another, the argument there is from Asimoglu and Robertson is that we need to change our political structures, even if we generally like our political structures, in order to create economic prosperity. And the main thing they argued there is to have a more inclusive society and that's less extractive. So their argument is to say that we should focus more on being able to establish, like, for example, a good sense of morality in legal systems, judicial systems that uphold that generally. The other thinker we brought in as well, North, would also argue to some extent that it can be the other way around, that like we need to look at interrogate our economic incentives and how they are influencing our institutions. I don't remember like what was his solution to that, right? But I think generally it's just that like we do need to be able to say, oh, this could be a bad thing, and therefore we should further interrogate it before we make decisive decisions as to what our institutions look like based on economic incentives, right? I think that we can, as a society, as experts in our society, do that, right? However, we don't think in that manner. We think in a very like instead of centralized or circular way, we just think incentives equals benefits without thinking through that incentives create institutional makeup, which broadly creates the fabric of our society. And so that's where I think that the way I describe things in my debating speeches, especially because if I just come up and I say these two authors' names and I say institutions 50 times in a speech, I'm kind of relying on the judge to also know about this kind of work. And I'm kind of relying on the judge to also know or have attended this session on institutions. And that's not going to fare well with me, right? Not all judges know what you're talking about when you bring up big and fancy words. So, what I always bring it back to is these three components about people, information, and policy, not police decisions. Okay. It's difficult to talk about all of the different aspects of this one law and talk about is this wording the right legal wording to define what we're trying to explain within society. We can't do that process of interrogation on a debate floor. But what we can do is we can talk about if you were in a situation, create a hypothetical, and this was what the law said, this is how you would react. Some instances, you might say that you have the law is too soft of an incentive compared to our economic incentive. And so we're willing to break the law or not perfectly abide to it in order to be able to have the chance at that economic incentive, right? Other times, because we do care about wanting to abide to the law, then we're okay to continue to abide to the law if the incentive is not that big and is not that mind-blowing or pivotal to our existence. And so that's the way I would explain it through. Just talk about the people and how they would think through and react to this. And instead of just broadly just talking, mostly the people, but again, also the information and the policy decisions, because that helps us to understand like, oh, okay, we're not just talking about this grandiose piece of like evidence that we're trying to change. We're talking about rational individuals. We can all imagine what a rational individual looks like and how they would react, and trying to direct them to a reaction that would create the impacts that I'm trying to establish within my speech. Does that answer your question, Isaac?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
No problem, because there was two parts of that question, which was both like generally how do we get that change, and also then how do we display that in our debate speeches. Okay, I'm enjoying this so much, guys. Any other questions? I never get to talk about my research. This is so much fun. If there's no other questions, that just means I probably did a really good job. Some other comments was just like the section about the historical effects institutions have on present conditions was insightful. Oh, thank you guys. Appreciate you so much. But that's all. I know I've gone 20 minutes over, so hopefully Martha is not going to be upset with the big file I'm going to send her now. But I'll see you guys all at your respective tournaments. And what are the best examples? I think, Joshua, if you have some more explicit idea of what you're talking about, I can help you there.
Yeah. I do have one more question. Uh,
Sure.
I don't know if it's connected, but it's on descriptive analysis, and I wanted to ask if you have any suggestions or any information on also how to use that for like maybe other teams for debate. I don't know.
Okay. Just like just like any other like worksheets and things like that. One thing I will point to is Hadar Goldberg's workshop online on YouTube about burdens of proof. Even though it's talking generally about burdens of proof, and they use some um, tools that help me to establish more descriptive analysis, like, for example, absorbing your challenges. So, thinking, well, then they're going to say, but what about this? And acknowledging that in your speech in a positive way before someone is able to make that rebuttal towards you. They also look at like cookie cutters, which are small ways that you can analyze bigger debates, and then you can apply them to a multitude of debates under the same topic. And that can also help you guys to broaden your descriptive analysis. Joshua, I think I'm going to message you because I've got lots of resources for you. I think I'm just going to message you privately. Other than that, guys, I think we're going to end it off here. But thanks so much, everybody, for attending. It's so nice. We had about like 40 people at the top of it. That was really exciting. All right. I hope you guys all enjoy your evening, and I'll see you guys in the YouTube comment section. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
And thanks to the people who drew on my slides.